Good afternoon, everybody. I see more and more people popping in here. Looks like we've got about 22 so far. If you would, in the chat, once you've logged in, just put your name and what organization you're with, and that'll kind of give me an idea of who's with us today. Hey, Pat. Kim. Abigail. Okay, seeing a lot of names popping up here. Most of them I know, some of them I don't know. Julie, Joe, Anna. Okay, Anna's got her whole crew. Greer, hi Greer. Elaine, okay. Hi, Fate. It's like Elaine's got a whole team also. Youth advocates here, House of Ruth, Carol Rowan. Okay, 26 people so far. Zero V, good to see you all. Okay, got some folks from Humana here. Awesome. House of Ruth again. Okay, if you're just logging on, please put your name and your organization in the chat so we can see who's in the room with us today. Wait about one more minute and then I'll turn it over to you, Ryan. Hi, Alan. All right, then, let's make this happen today. Thank you, everybody, for signing in and for your participation today. We've got a lot of material to cover, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time introducing anybody. I'll let them take care of that themselves, but we've got Ryan Villagran and Khalil Martin from Housing First University for Not Another Housing First training. So fellas, I'm gonna turn it over to you, and if you want to say more about yourself and your roles, go right ahead and impart your wisdom to us. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Laura. Thanks everybody for having us. It's exciting to get an opportunity to talk about Housing First. I know it's not your first rodeo, but hopefully it'll be novel and exciting in terms of how we present today. So my name is Ryan Villagran. I use they and them pronouns, and I'm a training specialist with Housing First University. Housing First University is a training and technical assistance organization operating out of Pathways to Housing PA. So Pathways is a homeless services organization in Philadelphia. We've been here since about 2008, working to end chronic homelessness using the Housing First model. We're very proud that we used that model to fidelity, high fidelity Housing First as it was constructed in the Pathways to Housing model back in '92 in New York City. We actually grew out of that first Housing First agency and have since become our own fiscal entity around 2012, 2013. So we've been working a long time doing this work in this way. We're housing close to 600 folks in that scattered site Housing First model. So folks get their own apartment right from the street, often after having experienced unsheltered homelessness for a number of years, that chronic homelessness status. Because we adhere so closely to the Housing First model, we see very similar outcomes to what you see in the research literature around Housing First, including an 85% housing retention rate after a 5-year period. So folks are staying housed, and we're so thrilled that these days we have an alumni program where folks don't need us anymore, right? We flip them to a housing choice voucher, and we're able to see them have success in their own apartments, even without all the wraparound supports anymore. So that's a little bit about myself, about Housing First University and Pathways. I want to just pass the mic over to my co-presenter to introduce himself.
Hello, everybody. My name is Khalil Martin. I use he, him, and his pronouns. So I'm in the Philadelphia area. I am a therapist who no longer works full-time, actually at Pathways of Housing PA with Ryan, but I spent a lot of time in the training department with Ryan doing this very thing, and haven't been able to not do it since I've left. So that's been cool to stay connected in this way. I really, really do value the Housing First model as really a solution to homelessness. Prior to my role in the training department at Pathways Housing PA, I was leading the polysubstance use team there. So doing and executing Housing First the best that I could with the team that I had and doing this work. So I hope to bring some of that experience as well to the training.
Awesome. Some quick housekeeping, just inviting folks to be present. It's a 2-hour session today, including a long Q&A. And I would love, we are in webinar format, but I would love for folks to be raising their little Zoom hands, using the chat, using the Q&A panel. It's so much more lively and fun when we can be in dialogue together rather than Khalil and I just kind of preaching into the void for 2 hours. So we're able to offer CE credit for licensed social workers. And so if that is you and you'd like CE credit for this session, we need you to do a couple things. Stay the whole time, participate in our discussions in the chat, and not turn your camera on, but just sort of be present and demonstrate to us that you're here. The other way that you'll do that is by completing a short course evaluation at the end of our session. So we'll drop a link to a course eval in the chat, and you can let us know that you're looking for that credit. Even if you don't need credit, we love the feedback. So if you're able to provide some feedback in that survey, we would love that. We do plan to take a very short break in the training. I'm not sure exactly when that's going to occur. Going to let the content sort of dictate that to us. And then I wanted to let you know that the slides and some other materials are going to be emailed to you following the training. So don't feel like you need to furiously screenshot all the material or take down notes or things like that unless you'd like to. All right, here's what we're going to cover today in this session. We are going to talk a little bit about the history of the Housing First model. We'll talk about why Housing First is needed. What problems does it solve? As I mentioned, we're very proud of the model and very proud of our fidelity to the model, but we want to also describe these 5 key principles that even if you're not following the model to high fidelity, I think these key principles need to be in place for us to call ourselves a Housing First organization. We'll talk about some benefits and challenges of the model, and we'll compare it to maybe more traditional models that we're accustomed to. And we'll talk about the process of initiating services in a Housing First program. And we'll wrap up with a very short discussion on some overlap of other evidence-based practices that are crucial to the implementation of Housing First. And then we hope to have at least 30 minutes for Q&A. Would love at that time, if you're maybe not a convert to Housing First or not seeing it work in the way that it was supposed to, would love to kind of just engage in a dialogue at that time about any feedback you have or thoughts or comments or questions. In terms of learning objectives, by the end of this session, we want you to be able to recognize barriers to housing stability for folks with disabilities. We want you to be able to identify the 5 key principles of the Housing First model. And we want you to be able to explain the benefits of Housing First versus traditional recovery-based housing models. Okay, here's the chance for us to kind of engage in dialogue a little bit together. We'll start the ball rolling with a quick temperature check. So asking you to, in the chat, find yourself on this slide and indicate whether you're a 1, a 2, or a 3. So if you're a 1, maybe that means you know a lot about Housing First. You might even consider yourself a bit of an expert. If you're a number 2, you're somebody that has some experience with or knowledge of Housing First. And if you're number 3, you're a person who maybe identifies as knowing very little about Housing First. So I see the numbers starting to roll in the chat. Keep that coming. Want to kind of just get a sense of where we're at today. This is great. I'll keep letting your responses roll in. A lot of 1s in the chat, which I love because it means we have a lot to teach today. We have a lot to be able to share. A lot of 2s also, though, right? So folks maybe are already doing the work or at least know quite a bit about it. And even a couple 3s. Some experts in the room would love to hear your voice in this meeting today, sharing your own experience with the model. Anna Terry is with a group of folks, maybe kind of watching together. So 1s and 2s in the group there. Love it. Okay, thanks so much for sharing kind of where you're at. Let me get us into this a little bit. So a quick introduction to Housing First. And Khalil is going to kind of take us through the high fidelity versus a maybe less formal way of experiencing Housing First. Lowercase h, lowercase f. Go for it.
So when an agency is striving to be a capital H, capital F Housing First agency, right? When we want to follow Housing First to fidelity as closely to this book, right? These principles that we can, these are what we're talking about, these 38 distinct fidelity measures that use an assertive case management team or an intensive case management team in permanent supportive housing settings. So it's important to know that this is evidence-based, right? This comes from somewhere. I want to talk about where in a little bit. But the goal is to assist individuals experiencing chronic homelessness. We'll also talk about that definition in a little bit also, but who are living with severe mental illness and or substance use disorders. The hope is that folks are housed immediately or as soon as possible, depending on availability of units. And there are no preconditions or barriers, right? Folks don't need to be sober or engaging in any sort of mental health or substance use treatment to engage or to be engaged by a Housing First program. And then, of course, so I like to say for people who are not familiar that in a nutshell, Housing First is giving somebody a home, is putting somebody in a home, right? But that is a little too simple, but I think in its simplest form is that. But of course, it also comes with a bunch of wraparound services, right? Because we know it doesn't end there. But then also we have Housing First principles, right? Some agencies and institutions and programs aren't designed to be kind of targeting homelessness specifically, right? So I think about our like domestic violence shelters or intimate partner violence kind of settings, short-term like shelter settings, right? The goal is not to be a house or a home for that person. But still, we believe that these places can adapt some Housing First principles. So we think typically in these settings, when folks land in these trainings, that they want to be adopting some low barrier housing principles that sound or feel a little bit closer to the Housing First model. So these programs seek to meet folks where they are and their basic needs first, and then again, provide those wraparound services that we know are really important. Alrighty, so we will talk a little bit more about what it is, the model. So it's an evidence-based program. It's been around for maybe more than 30 years now. Nobody was like, this is a good idea here, right? Well, I mean, of course, that's how it might have started, right? But since then, now we're able to collect a lot of data and numbers and evidence about what putting folks in homes looks like. It assists individuals experience, oh, we talked about this, right? Folks who have a chronic homelessness history, so they've been street homeless for at least a year, and then they might have either a severe mental illness or a substance use disorder, many times both, right? There is a lot of overlap. Again, we're housing folks as immediately as we can, no preconditions, and providing those wraparound supports for folks. Alrighty. So now we'll talk a little bit more about some of that evidence and history. So it was founded by Dr. Sam Simbaris in 1992. I studied social work, not math, so someone else can, do that calculation. But it was added to SAMHSA's National Registry of Evidence-Based Programs in 2007. So if folks are not familiar with SAMHSA, someone else can also go ahead and write what that acronym stands for. But basically, this compiles a whole bunch of just like, here's what is evidence-based and works, right? For folks with mental health and substance use disorders. It's been replicated in over 150 US cities and also in many other countries. Thanks, Ryan. Ryan went ahead and put what SAMHSA actually is in the chat. Pathways to Housing PA has been operating in Philadelphia since 2008. And there are some other Pathways kind of organizations nearby, Pathways Vermont and Pathways DC. Alrighty, so this is a very broad and pretty big question, but what are some of the things that we think cause homelessness? And you can go ahead and fire those off in the chat. There's a lot of folks here, so yeah, feel free to go ahead and offer up some ideas. And if that is a little more like difficult or feels silly because we're all like working in the field and we know, we can go ahead and fire off some of the stereotypes too. Those are sometimes more fun to be talking about. Yeah, but we see some good answers in the chat. Lack of affordable housing, limited income, inadequate affordable housing, mental health issues. They want to be homeless is something that we hear often, right? A little bit of like stuff that exists in like the stigma realm, right? Here are some of the stereotypes now. People are lazy, substance use disorder. I don't know if this person meant that's a stereotype or that is what causes homelessness, but I think there's something to say in both of those spaces there. Yeah, a huge one is that folks are lazy. We know that can you advance the slides, Brian? The bullets, yeah. We know that homelessness can be comprised of a bunch of environmental factors, right? But also individual factors. Now, when we say individual factors, we're not talking about somebody's laziness, right? Somebody's motivation to be housed. We're talking about things that are less in somebody's control, right? So something like a mental health diagnosis, lack of housing availability, the access to like institutional supports somebody might have. What's it look like to be born poor, right? And how's that like a very quick or kind of like express pathway to homelessness, right? These are some of the individual factors, and we want to be clear that most of these individual factors are not necessarily in an individual's control. But we also know there are we've talked about some of the environmental factors already: housing cost, housing availability, employment being a big thing, and then also a big part of this is also going to be some pretty just outward and obvious oppression that has been documented since people have been alive, right? Racist and exclusionary housing policies will play a role in homelessness, always. I see some more things in the chat. We'll make sure we grab these. Yeah, some more. We see disabilities in here as definitely something that can like lead to maybe somebody's homelessness experience. Maybe one of the stereotypes is folks aren't trying to work or find employment. I'll tell you all a funny story. I was with some friends of mine the other day, like driving in a car. We live in Philadelphia, and I think one of my friends, like family members, was with us, not really a city person, and was talking about somebody who had been panhandling, right? So somebody who had been asking for change or money on the street. And one of our other friends gave this person $1, right? And my friend's cousin is like, what are they gonna do with it? And we're like, well, I don't know, whatever they want, right? What do you think they're gonna do with that money, right? But I think even just the question comes from a large amount of stigma, right, and stereotypes. You think they're gonna buy a house with that $1, right? You think that's what they're paneling you for? Absolutely not, right? Living on the street and outside is difficult, and I think when we think about that in context, that can also be a lot of the reason that our folks tend to cope with substances throughout their lives and homelessness experience. So, environmental factors and individual factors. Just some stats here that we think are important to share to kind of bring ourselves a little closer to the experience. I think that I know that I enjoy kind of like touching that space that we think exists between us and our participants so many times, right? And bringing us a little bit closer. So one of the stats that we like to share is that 49% of folks in our country are not equipped to cover a $400 emergency expense, right? This could be a medical emergency, a mental health emergency, a housing emergency, right? Possibly leading to homelessness. And for many folks, $400 can be the difference between sleeping in their bed or sleeping outside, right? So those are one of the stats that we like to share here around how we might not be super far removed or super far away from the lives of the folks that we're serving on a regular basis. Alrighty, Ryan, we're ready for the next slide. So who are the chronically homeless? So the Housing First model uses HUD's definition of chronically homeless. And that definition is pretty much here in like the number piece, right? Those who have been homeless for at least 1 year or have experienced homelessness multiple times. And that can be documented, or there is evidence of that like throughout that person's year. These are the folks that are often considered not ready for housing because of unmanaged mental illness, substance use disorders, and or physical disabilities. And I don't know if this comes up again, but this idea of housing readiness is something we might touch on. Yes, Ryan says yes. So we'll talk about housing readiness and maybe some of the harmful things that come from like this idea, or that we hold so close to our chests sometimes. But the folks that we're engaging in with the Housing First model have typically tried and failed in multiple programs, right? Not always because of their own doing, but because of what that program is set up for and some other like structural issues and it not being a Housing First program, right? Or folks who just have been unsuccessfully engaged. There's a huge kind of outreach component to the Housing First model, right? Where we are going out into community and finding folks. And folks living on the street are not always going to be easy to find. So I think this is another thing that leads to unsuccessful engagement. Of course, there are barriers and reasons people don't want to receive services, but in addition, I think just the idea of finding somebody and going in the community can lead to that engagement issue.
Can I just chime in here? We are going to talk a little bit more about housing readiness as a concept, but I do want to just add here that I think it's easy for us to paint a comment like the second bullet as kind of a negative thing, right? Oh my gosh, these folks were not able to be successfully engaged because they were considered not ready for housing. I think when people are actually having these conversations in practice, it feels softer, it feels kinder, right? It's like, I don't know if such and such is really going to be able to manage an apartment on their own. And thus, let's make sure that they kind of gain the skills to be in an apartment through the shelter setting, finally up through transitional housing, and maybe eventually permanent housing. But really, they got to prove it to us, right? And I think people will paint that perspective as helpful to the person who they're serving, right? I'm helping them get the skills to sort of like be in a home. And so I just want to kind of note here, and then we'll move on, that I really do see that as a pretty paternalistic perspective when we're talking about other human beings. And want to offer just here that that housing readiness requirement is not necessary.
Yeah, I
When
hear
people
Ryan
need
kind
it.
of talking around this idea of like tough love, like people need to learn a lesson, right? One time at a training in person, I said tough love wasn't evidence-based, and somebody found a book and showed it to us, which was one person's experience, and that is evidence. But um, I think we'd argue that housing first is a little more evidence-based than tough love is. Alrighty, this might be familiar to some folks. I think I learned about this in like a biology class in high school, right? This is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. If you studied something closely related to the helping profession, psych, social work, sociology, probably also something you've seen before. Like to say that helping professionals love a triangle, right? So this is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Um, uh, it is a motivational theory in psychology proposed by Abraham Maslow in 1943. Um, it's comprised of a five-tier model of human needs, often depicted as hierarchical levels within a pyramid. I read that straight off the paper. People know what this is. But what what the housing first model seeks to meet first are these physiological and safety needs, right? Um, so this is where we're working often. And if you think about some other, I want to make sure I'm not getting ahead of myself. If you think about other kind of like treatment models or programs, maybe that you've worked in or are referring folks to, sometimes this is flipped on its head, right? We want folks to be working on some esteem needs, right? We want them to be engaging in self-actualization and be connected to a therapist, right? And what does it look like to have a therapy session for 60 minutes and then go sleep outside, right? It's um I think that's where a model like this can be helpful. And like, wait a minute, what are we doing? Do we need to backtrack? Are there some other things that need to be considered first? I think we do crisis and de-escalation trainings too, and this is also something to be considering, right? What are somebody's just like base level needs? What are they coming to me with already? Did they eat that day? So this is something we like to keep in mind. But as it relates to the housing first model, I think we'd love to support folks with all of these things. But the first things we're going to be targeting are going to be those um, physical needs, our physiological needs, and our safety needs. And through those wraparound services, we can start kind of targeting these other levels of Maslow's hierarchy of needs.
One of the things that I've been thinking about lately related to the hierarchy of needs is we probably all know somebody who did that thing that Howell is talking about, right? Like I went and, or a person living on the streets went and did therapy and changed their relationship to substances and figured out how to like deal with what they were dealing with, trauma or whatever. And they were able to sort of like work their way up through the system into housing. I know that there are people out there in the world living that way or who have successfully achieved housing in that way. My suggestion is that like most other human behavior, it exists on a bell curve, right? Where you probably have some outliers that are able to like make that work. But I think most folks are going to need the safety and security of food and water and warmth and rest, a shelter over their heads before they can even begin to think about what it would look like to change their relationship to any of the decisions that they're making on a regular basis in their lives. Um, so yeah, it is possible that, you know, that people sort of like hop around on this hierarchy, but I think in general, for the larger percentage of folks that we're serving, and certainly for the folks who have not been successful in more traditional recovery-based programs, that's not going to work, right? And because this is sort of this theory of human motivation proposes that it's kind of similar for all of us. In fact, what we find is that once people's base needs are met, they self-direct themselves to meeting their other needs, right? Once I have my base needs met, as a human being, I'm going to want to seek belongingness and love and esteem and self-actualization. And so by providing that leg up, I think we're sort of like more rapidly pushing people up the triangle, up the hierarchy of needs. The last thing I'll say about this is that Abraham Maslow did spend a bunch of time on indigenous reservations and kind of lifted a lot of this content that you don't see a lot of that represented in his paper.
Yeah, I think I'd like to just add on there, Ryan. I think the idea of Maslow like observing this in like other communities, indigenous communities, I think also kind of like removes this idea and just like how essential community is to like healing and having social supports is. I think a lot of times in the therapy space specifically, we're taught to like view this person like they have all the tools to reach self-actualization by themselves, right? Which we know is really not even how this model came to be, right? So I just think that's another important note. Thanks for sharing that, Ryan. This is a quote by the executive director of Pathways Vermont, and it says that the mental health system, as it is, isn't accessible to thousands of individuals. What are we doing wrong? Imagine a hungry person with a wallet full of money standing outside a restaurant, but not going inside. The restaurant owner is changing his window display, he's offering specials, and pumping the smell of fresh bread outside. And still, the hungry person with a wallet full of cash won't come inside. That's what's happening with our mental health system of care and the people who need it most, right? We might be missing some engagement tools. This might not be a population deficiency, right? This might be a matter of how we are engaging these folks and bringing them in. Um, we, yeah, that's that. That's this quote.
All right. I'm going to take us through um, some ideas around the key principles of housing first. Um, we think that despite the many challenges, environmental and individual challenges that folks are facing, that ending homelessness is possible. And I think using the 5 key principles is the pathway to doing that, the 5 key principles of housing first. So actually, let me pause here. I just want to check in with folks. Are there any questions, comments, or thoughts that you're sitting with right now before we move into this section? We want to make space for you if that's your experience. Cool. Not seeing anything in the chat or in the Q&A box. Feel free to hit those boxes freely. Okay, so these are the key principles of housing first. Housing first certainly is an evidence-based practice, but only when the model is employed in full. And so, we do a lot of training and technical assistance with organizations that maybe say that they're doing housing first, and yet we find that there might be some gaps in terms of full implementation of the model. And so, of course, like the sort of research outcomes and all that good stuff that we talk about is not going to land 100% when we're not doing the model 100%, right? So I think fidelity to the model matters, but even without fidelity to the model, I think it is these key principles that hold it all together, right? And so to the extent that we can implement these key principles, even if we're not doing high fidelity housing first, I think we have a leg up in terms of the outcomes that we're hoping to seek. So we're going to dig into these. I do see a question that came in the chat asking, once housed, are the wraparound services required? Yeah, I will say that folks who really are advocating against housing first will often talk about housing first as like a housing only type program, and we're setting people up for failure. And in fact, the wraparound services throughout somebody's time in a housing first program are necessary. That's what enables people to maintain their tenancy successfully, even when other people think that they're not housing ready or wouldn't be successful. So yes, the wraparound services are required. And again, that comes through either an ACT team, an interdisciplinary assertive community treatment team, or through an ICM team, intensive case management team. We have both here at Pathways, though most of our services are using the ACT team model. Thanks for the question. Okay, so let's dig into these. The first key principle is immediate access to permanent housing with no housing readiness requirements. This principle is based on the idea that housing is a human right, not a privilege, not something that we should expect someone to earn. And we do see a lot of housing supports that are sort of on an earn it basis. And we're going to talk a little bit about the challenges with that as we move forward. There are also no housing readiness requirements. In other words, somebody doesn't have to demonstrate anything to us in order to be eligible for the program. And by anything, I really mean sobriety, access to mental health treatment, access to medical treatment. These things are not required for somebody to become eligible for a Housing First program. The chronic homelessness status and the presence of a substance use disorder and or a mental health disorder are the only real requirements, nothing related to housing readiness. And I will say housing readiness comes in sort of sneaky ways sometimes. In other words, not just things that are written out in policy, but things like, okay, you'll be able to get your housing, but first I need you to go collect all your documents, and I need you to make sure you have your SSI check in order, and birth certificates, social security numbers, blah, blah, blah. You have to have all that and then come back and see us. Well, that's a housing readiness requirement. Certainly many of the folks that we house here would not be able to achieve all of those things on their own without significant support. And so I think we need to be cautious here about maybe informal housing readiness requirements that we're sort of accidentally or on purpose putting in place. I'll also say immediate access to permanent housing is a key part of the Housing First model. There's no endpoint. There's no predetermined endpoint. It is expected that it's permanent. When we start to have a predetermined endpoint, we're really not operating in Housing First as I understand it to the model. Now, what we do see is transitional housing and rapid rehousing type programs that, purport to do housing first. I think they're doing lowercase h, lowercase f. No judgment there. I think that's a needed service and support. But I struggle with how to identify a program like that because it's certainly not permanent, right? And I think often what we see in those types of shorter term settings is the people that those programs were designed for do great. 2 years of rent paid. Now I'm paying my rent on my own. I've got a job and I don't need you anymore. But the folks with higher levels of need end up languishing in those programs unsuccessfully. The second key principle is participant choice and self-determination. This is here in order to promote the inherent worth and dignity of everyone. We want to provide choices at every stage in the process and the opportunity for self-determination at every stage in the process. We think this is sort of inherently part and parcel of a trauma-informed approach, right? Allowing people to have a increased level of safety and increased level of control over their lives will be an antidote to some forms of trauma.
Ryan, I'm gonna
Please, yes,
pop in
go
for
ahead.
just a second. This is Laura.
Yep.
Yolanda had a follow-up question. I think this is a good point to bring this up. She said about the wraparound services. Is it the provider decision to provide the services, or is it the decision of the participant?
It's a good question. I think different Housing First agencies may answer this question slightly differently. My understanding of how we do it here at Pathways means that the wraparound supports are the program. That's, it is a program that operates through those housing, through those wraparound supports. And the way we actualize that is through home visits, right? And so folks, according to the Housing First model, are expected to receive once weekly home visits, right? They're never going to have to come into some office here unless they want to. We have drop-in space for that. But us going into the home is the program operating, right? It's not just the house. It's the case management supports. The way we do it is when people sign a use and occupancy agreement, which is similar to a sublease, right? We master lease all of our units and sublease to our participants. Part of that use and occupancy agreement is the requirement that they receive home visits. So I guess maybe the answer is both, but this is the way we do the program. And if you're not agreeing to home visits, we're having a lot of conversation when and how we can. We're doing a ton of engagement work. We're not just sort of letting it die, right? If you don't let me in your apartment once, I don't go away and say, this person is not eligible for our program anymore, right? I'm going over and over again. I'm making phone calls. I'm trying to find creative ways to engage this person. I'm saying, hey, let's go meet at a Denny's for a little bit and talk about this. Let's, lunch is on me today. Let's figure this out in as many different creative ways as possible. It doesn't just die there, but it is necessary for them to receive home visits and to receive that wraparound support. Sometimes what that support looks like, they don't want anything to do with us. They agree to let us in for 15 minutes at a time once a week. We do as much as we can in that 15 minutes, and then we go home. And they've met the requirement. What we find, though, is that when folks are less willing to receive that support, we then tend to have more problems with landlords, more problems with their tenancy, and we end up having to move folks out of those units. And hopefully we'll try again as we continue to develop those tenancy skills. I hope that answered your question, Elaine. It's a good one, and it's a nuanced one because no, people don't always want us coming to visit them. Okay, moving on to our third key principle. I wanted to say regarding participant choice and self-determination, again, trying to build in choice at every step of the process, but that means you have to have many choices available. So, if we say that you should have choice about what your treatment is going to look like, we have to have on-site substance use support and on-site mental health support and on-site medical support, right? And so we kind of see ourselves as a one-stop shop that people can pick and choose from, but it is their choice to engage at any point in the process. We even give choices to people about what part of the city do you want to live in? No, we don't have apartments in our downtown center city district. That would be great. I would maybe also choose to live there. I can't afford that either. But to the extent that we can give choices, we're sometimes showing folks 3 apartments. Hey, which of these 3 do you like? Let's go look at them and let them make choices. I see your follow-up comment, Elaine. What I've seen is that participants, once housed, don't want to be bothered, and we do have more landlord issues. Yeah, we see that too. But a housing first model is going to incorporate a ton of assertive engagement and motivational interviewing to grease those wheels, right? We can't just let it die there. And I think I see your comment too that services should be required from the provider. I think we do that via the use and occupancy agreement, right? You agree to live in this apartment under this condition that you're going to receive support from us. When you're violating that use and occupancy agreement, at some point it may be necessary to end that agreement, but we're going to try everything we can to make sure that that doesn't happen. It's the worst thing if somebody ends up back on the streets.
Yeah, I just want to echo like the sort of engagement piece and like the creativity that Ryan was talking about. Because we also want to preserve the housing status of the folks that we're serving, we've been really creative with how we are engaging them. And it's not in like a gaslighty, like magical way. We're not tricking folks into remaining housed. Sometimes it looks like just like coming back to like their goal of like wanting to remain housed, right? And us letting them know like we want to support you in remaining housed, right? And here's how we in its rawest form, here's how we receive funding to be able to continue doing this, right? And I think that's when we see folks have more maybe understanding or willingness to engage. But I also think like the housing first model is set up to be like the engagement is not very, it's not a lot, right? It's not unless somebody needs it to be or wants it to be, and then we can kind of change and pivot there. Yeah.
Thanks for adding that. Here's the third key principle: multiple pathways of recovery orientation. What I mean here is that, or what the model means here is that recovery can be defined fairly broadly. We see the use of the word recovery even in like mental health spaces that have nothing to do with substance use disorder. But it is from here where we sort of situate a harm reduction approach, right? One of the things that we sometimes talk about is that harm reduction is possible without housing first, right, on its own. But housing first is not possible without harm reduction. So sort of understanding that people are going to make the choices for what feels right for them in their life. And we can support those choices while helping make them as safe as possible. So we're not forcing abstinence or treatment on anyone. We love it when people choose a kind of more abstinence-oriented recovery if that's what they're choosing for themselves. But really our goal here is to help support folks in defining what recovery looks like for them, right? And so bringing a ton of support to that conversation, making heavy use of peer supports, right? We use certified peer specialists, especially to kind of offer a sense of hope and possibility, and also help this definitional work. What do you want for yourself? What are your goals? What would recovery look like for you? Maybe recovery doesn't look like abstinence from substances, but maybe it looks like a reduction by this amount, because that'll help you feel more in control and able to budget your money better and pay your bills better. But again, it really goes back to the participant. And we have to sort of be open and accepting of different ways that this can look for folks. In that vein, the fourth key principle is individualized and participant-driven supports. I think this can be really difficult for practitioners, for providers who are used to a non-housing first model. Folks often in our technical assistance conversations ask us to provide our policy. What do you do when a person does this? What do you do when a person doesn't open the door? How many chances do you give them, right? And a housing first model is going to really shy away from standardized policies like that. Policies that are sort of cut and dry. You only get 3 different apartments, and in your 4th apartment, you don't get rehoused again. That ignores individual experience. That cookie cutter approach is not going to be individualized enough and tailored to the needs of the folks that you're serving right in front of you. So that can be somewhat frustrating, I think, for staff. Kalo was a team leader, and I'm sure had many conversations with staff where they're saying, why don't we just cut them off? Why don't we just put a hard line? Why don't we show them tough love in this way? And maybe that's appropriate for a person, but sort of standardizing it does not end up being supportive of the broadest swath of folks, right? The other part here is that when people make a decision to alter their combination of services, you know what, I think I do want Suboxone now. We have to be ready to jump on that, right? It's participant driven. If they said they didn't want medication for opioid use disorder one week, but then the next week they do want it, we're ready to jump into action. And the vice versa. They said they wanted it, but now they're saying, no, I don't want this anymore. That's their choice, and it's participant driven and individualized. Okay, so you don't want that support. Is there anything else that we can provide or support you with to help you maintain your tenancy, right? To help you so you don't get kicked out of this apartment? Because I know that's what you said you wanted. And then finally, the 5th key principle is social and community inclusion. It's a piece that I think gets lost in the complexity, in the chaos of trying to house somebody who hasn't been housed in a while and trying to help them develop the skills to stay in that home successfully. Sometimes as people jump into their next phase of life where there's a roof over their head now for the first time in many years, it can be an isolating experience. It can cause a deal of loneliness. The folks who had their back out on the street are not here anymore. And they're told, no, you're not allowed to bring all those people inside with you, right? These are like 1-bedroom apartments, and you're not allowed to bring your 7 besties in with you. That is an isolating experience, right? And people feel guilty. Why am I the one that gets this home, but my friend doesn't? And so our effort here is to help people refocus in on community inclusion, is to think holistically about what it means to lead a happy life. What are those meaningful social activities that allow us to feel good about the lives we're living? And so here at Pathways, we do have a whole community inclusion department that focuses on this. They're doing things like restaurant club. When's the last time one of our people who's been living on the street had an opportunity to go and get a hot cooked meal in a restaurant that somebody serves to them, that somebody else pays for? I think it's a really fun experience for them, right? Garden clubs, tenant union meetings, a number of other activities, sometimes even advocacy. We've had folks go down to the state capitol and advocate for better mental health care, better housing care, etc. Even religious and civic activities are included in this piece. These are critical components to living a happy life, and so it's a part of the model. All right. So we've talked so much about fidelity. We keep using this word fidelity. This training is the only time I ever use the word fidelity so frequently in my entire life. But want to talk a little bit about those fidelity measures that we keep talking about, right? How do we measure housing first? We think that without those 5 key principles we just talked about, we may not even really be talking about housing first. But for folks who are looking to explore high fidelity housing first and adhere to an evidence-based program model, it's those 38 individual measures in 5 categories. And so the categories are housing choice and structure, right? So folks having choice in the type of housing that they want. Separation of housing and services. It's pretty core to the model that we have both housing services here and clinical services here. At Pathways, it operates under one roof. It is possible to do that in separate organizations, right? You have a housing organization and a clinical organization, and we collaborate to serve people. We find it much easier and simpler to do that all under one roof, but we keep them separate. Those are separate things. People pay their rent to our housing department, and they have conversations about behavioral health concerns with the clinical department, and a ton of meetings to make sure that everybody's on the same page and people aren't falling through the cracks. We'll talk about service philosophy, the service array, like actually what's possible and what's available in a given program, and then the program structure are all the categories that you'll find those 38 fidelity measures meeting. We have a tip sheet with the Housing First fidelity measures that we're going to send out with these materials, so you can see how we rate ourselves. And it's a pretty simplistic measure. It's, do you provide ACT team services? Never, sometimes, always. Right? It's a pretty simple way of sort of assessing, am I doing housing first? And that might be a nice way for you to think about for your program. Are there gaps? Are there areas to like improve on if we want to continue moving in the direction of housing first implementation? Okay. Ready to talk a little bit about some of the benefits and challenges as we see it in housing first. So number one, a more than 30-year track record of evidence. There's a ton of research about housing first. It's not a newfangled radical thing. I think some people are still just hearing about housing first for the first time, but it's not new. And in fact, I think many of the ways that people are becoming introduced to housing first is through kind of right-wing think tanks that are interested in defunding housing first programs. And so I want to let you know that there's a ton that's been written and experimented with and researched around housing first. I'll share again that stat that we're very proud of. You're typically going to find an 85 to 90% housing retention rate after 5 years. You're also going to find a decrease in the need for more expensive programs. It can reduce the need for more long-term shelters and transitional housing programs. These types of programs are very expensive to serve people. What you're going to find is also increased medication compliance and treatment adherence, not because we're requiring it, but because people have their basic needs met, and we're having conversations with them about what might it take to get to the next level of like happiness or stability for you. We're finding that we find that it also decreases hospitalization time. Thinking about mental health hospitalization especially, but even medical hospitalization, when you have access to preventive and ongoing care, the more emergency and acute type of care is going to reduce. A big thing that we're on right now that we're pitching to our MCOs in the area is the frequency of ER visits that our hospitals are not getting paid for within a 30-day period. We've got some data. One person who went within a 6-month period was at the emergency room over 40 times. So simply having somebody housed with medical, like a nurse going out and visiting on a regular basis, is going to immediately start to decrease that hospitalization. I see a comment in the chat. Please share the slides. Gonna share that to your email. Thanks for providing that. We also find increased participant satisfaction with services, especially around community inclusion, around family reunification, people's independence increases. Some of these sort of benefits are not always seen in more traditional housing programs that maybe have less focus on the broad, holistic provision of services. Another benefit of the Housing First model is a quick startup time. We use HUD subsidies, permanent supportive housing subsidies, through the continuum of care here in Philadelphia. And for that reason, once we have a subsidy in hand and once we have a landlord, it's very quick to sign a lease and get somebody in a home. So right now, because of the lack of affordable housing that we're seeing, we're housing people in around a 3-month time frame from when we first meet them. But there have been times in our history where we've been able to house people within 2 to 4 weeks of meeting them. It's just a matter of kind of all the pieces coming together at the right time. I'm kind of contrasting this with maybe a program that operates all out of one building, right? We purchase a building, or we're building a new building of permanent supportive housing units. That's going to take a lot of time and capital. A Housing First model using this scattered site way of housing people is much quicker to get people in the door. We also see wider community benefit, right? An improved quality of life for somebody is going to benefit both that individual and the community. There's going to be less folks sleeping on the streets, less folks experiencing symptoms of serious mental illness and substance use out kind of in the community. That's going to have an effect on neighbors. And we see sort of a reduction in that. In fact, our business district here in Philadelphia, of course, because of the way businesses work, don't want to have panhandlers outside of their businesses, right? So we kind of have a you scratch our back, we'll scratch yours approach with them, where they're actually funding outreach workers who work at Pathways, right? And so those outreach workers are making every effort to engage with those folks and bring them inside. We think it's good for everybody. Wanted to kind of share, we grabbed this slide from CSH, Corporation for Supportive Housing. I think it's a really great demonstration of another impact that we see, another benefit that we see, which is that people's health is going to improve when they're engaged through a Housing First program, right? Moving into a home creates both physical and psychological healing. People move from this like stigmatized outcast person to a valuable community member who lives in their own home. In terms of health, we see that it prevents the onset of new illness and injury, these things that occur as people are sleeping rough, sleeping outside, doing what it takes to survive. It's also going to improve access to high quality, coordinated health and behavioral health care, and of course, all the other wraparound supports that we provide, right? The way it works here at Pathways is we have an FQHC, a health clinic right here on site, where most people get most of their primary care needs met. That's only possible because of the program, because of the one-stop shop nature of an integrated Housing First approach. And then lastly, the sort of promotion of lifestyle behaviors that lead to good health. I'm talking simple things here. Helping people go grocery shopping, put some vegetables in your cart, put some good protein in your cart, have some fruit in your cart, right? These are lifestyle behaviors that are not always accessible to folks who are living on the street, who don't have a home of their own, or who maybe are at the whim of shelter staff, soup kitchens, things like that. So kind of just trying to indicate the way that there's an avalanching of better health as people become housed. Now, I will say people's health costs are going to precipitously increase when they're first housed. They're sometimes seeing a doctor for the first time, bunch of procedures that need to happen, bunch of care that needs to happen initially, but that levels off and eventually decreases in terms of cost as people's health becomes a priority in their lives. So talking a little bit about costs here, these numbers are area specific to us, and they're a little outdated, but I wanted to show you that in terms of cost of care, an inpatient rehab is going to be much more expensive. Congregate housing, I'm thinking one of these like big building projects, are going to be much more expensive on a per person basis per night than a Housing First program. It actually costs us less to house a person, in fact, than it does to let them continue to be homeless. If we're adding up all the costs of a person who lives unsheltered, those folks are frequently arrested, see jail and prison time. Ambulance services are frequent, police intervention and the cost of that. Emergency department visits, as we mentioned, is going to be incredibly costly. Medical and psychiatric hospitalizations are costly. Having soup kitchens and shelters, these things cost resources and money. And so when we're able to sort of provide people a home, so much of this becomes unnecessary or less necessary, and it reduces costs that way. There's a 2011 study of our program in particular that showed that our program is less expensive per person than comparable programs serving the same population. And in fact, we're sometimes as much as half the cost of other permanent housing programs that operate here in Philadelphia. So Housing First is cheaper. It's good for the individual, and it's good for the community. Okay. Housing First is not. Want to dispel a couple of myths here, and I talked to some of this already. Housing First is not a new or radical idea. I mentioned it's been around for 30 years, 32. It's also not housing only. That wraparound support, as we've been kind of engaging in the chat dialogue, is necessary, but it's also based on a person's identified needs and wants in order to help them maintain their tenancy. Without supportive services, it's not going to work, and it's not Housing First, kind of point blank. There's also this idea out there in discussion circles that Housing First means anything goes, like it's no rules. And I don't find that to be true. Having choices and self-determination, that doesn't mean ultimate choice always, right? And so it also doesn't mean that folks are never going to face consequences for their actions. Now, we're very careful not to put like additional consequences in place for people. I'm not saying if you continue to do this behavior, we're going to restrict your access to our offices, or we're going to shut you out of your apartment for some length of time. We don't want to kind of implement program-based consequences, but there are reality consequences out there. If a landlord is upset because you're throwing really big parties and inviting a lot of people to your parties several nights a week, you're going to get asked to leave, right? I would get asked to leave. And so that's sort of a natural consequence that we're trying to help people navigate, but we don't have the power to protect people from all consequences, right? And so sometimes what it means is that we're able to reduce choices to the extent that people can keep themselves housed. There's also this idea that Housing First is a threat to the safety of other people, like in a given housing community. I'll just state outright that the link between violence and mental illness is a false stereotype. It's a false equivalence. In fact, folks with serious mental illness are more frequently the victims of violence, not the perpetrators of violence. It is going to be up to us to be advocates, though, out in the community. When people shout us down as case managers, they see us wearing our badge. They're saying, that person shouldn't be living alone. They're scary. They're dangerous. I think it's up to us to sort of counter some of that misinformation with facts of our own, and also kind of continue to promote the inherent worth and dignity of everybody. This is a person living in a home. If you're having a specific problem, we can talk about that. But if it's based on stigma and shaming of a person, that's not really the same thing, right? That person may not actually be a threat to the safety of other people. This is a very loaded term. Enabling. I think folks think of harm reduction approaches and Housing First approaches as enabling. My perspective is that we're not enabling people by providing them with basic needs. And typically, when we say enabling, I sometimes think that's a coded way of saying that maybe this person needs to suffer a little bit more. They haven't been through enough in order to have what I have access to every single night, right? In terms of a bed to sleep in, a roof over my head. And folks who make that complaint of enabling usually do so from the comfort of their own homes. I think if enabling is, allowing neighbors and community members to have access to a home, sign me up. I want us all to have access to that because I believe housing is a basic human right. Finally, Housing First, oh, got two more actually on this slide. An intervention that only works for some. We think Housing First can work for anybody. We're serving folks with varying levels of need here, and we're bringing in supportive and ancillary services when necessary. In fact, we think the folks that we serve have the highest level of need in a community-based setting. And so if it can work for those folks, we think it can work for just about anybody. Some common criticism of Housing First is that it's kind of a one-size-fits-all approach. We think that's a pretty quick way to identify somebody who may not know much about Housing First and maybe has never worked in a Housing First model. What makes Housing First so successful and also really challenging for the staff as you're kind of wrestling with decision making and doing case consultation is that the program is so individualized and it's so focused on individuals' goals and their strengths and their barriers that in fact can be frustrating. So it's far from a one-size-fits-all approach. The program is going to look very different between people, and it should. If it doesn't, if we're fitting people into specific boxes of how it should work for them, we may be over-controlling in terms of our processes and procedures. I'm talking a long time. Anything you want to add here, Khalil, before I go to the next one? Okay. Okay, there are some challenges with implementing Housing First. I'm sure you know that as providers. Certainly, we are seeing folks who have been out of care for a long time. They're going to have chronic and complicated conditions, and they're going to have had fewer resources and supports along the way. Our focus is going to be to screen people in, not screen people out. In our technical assistance conversations that we often have with organizations, I hear because somebody has really challenging behaviors or really chronic conditions that have been going on for a long time. I sometimes hear in providers that frustration, maybe even that vicarious trauma, and they're wanting to sort of like set some limits. We can't serve that person. There's too much going on there. Let's serve people who really want our services. And I would challenge those folks to screen people in. How can we serve more people? How can we serve the hardest people to house? This is the final stop on the journey sometimes for folks, right? And so we have to really pull out all the stops and all the creativity. Our system of care is, as I think the Hilary Melton quote demonstrated earlier that Kalo read, it's not always oriented to serve folks with the highest needs. And so resource allocation can be particularly challenging. And especially we see this, I don't mean to slam rapid rehousing settings, but I think we often see that like they have a finite set of resources and they want to house as many people as possible, but people get kind of stuck with too high of needs and an inability to get those needs met. And so I think the sort of flexibility that Housing First offers, both as a permanent supportive option and also the large team size, 8 to 10 staff members on a team with a shared caseload of around 80 people. It's a 10-to-1 staffing ratio. I think provides the flexibility to really meet people with the highest level of need. Another thing that we'll see is we may take a really harm reduction and person-centered approach with the folks that we serve, but there are always going to be providers out in the community who are not focused on harm reduction. And so it can be a real challenge to educate those folks. They may not hold the same values or orientation that we do, but we have to collaborate with them to help meet the basic needs of our participants. This often happens in the hospital setting, especially for our drug users who face a ton of stigma. They're expected to leave AMA. They're not provided with what they need to sort of maintain a hospital stay without leaving. And so a ton of work has to go into this collaboration and advocacy. Housing First can be really unpredictable. These are human people that we're dealing with, right? They're going to make choices that we don't agree with all the time. And we're going to have to deal with the fallout of those choices, including when somebody decides, you know what, there is copper piping in these walls and I'm going to go get all of it and I'm going to turn it in for some bucks, right? We're going to have to deal with that and many other circumstances like that. But ultimately, we think that level of choice is a healing mechanism. And people are going to make better choices the more they're afforded with opportunities to make choices and to increase their skill set. Similarly, folks are going to have different treatment needs. And so we're going to have a wide range of possibility and options available to them. But if it sounds easy, you know, you got your HUD subsidy, you got your clinical team, put them together, boop, diddy bop, diddy boop, we're done, we're good. It's of course not, right? Providing somebody with a home and supporting them is a complex intervention. It requires practice, it requires supervision, it requires teamwork. It can be easy to become overwhelmed and frustrated in this work and traumatized vicariously, burnt out. But I think translating those principles that we've talked about into day-to-day practice or day-to-day work is a practice that we can get better at. And I hope we're not doing that alone, right? I hope we're doing that in collaboration with each other. Whew, that was a lot. That was a mouthful, folks. Let me pause here. Are there questions, comments, thoughts, or concerns? I'll just make some space while we take a sip of water. Oh, I see a comment in the chat. How do you deal with language and cultural barriers? I think I want to cue you up for this, Khalil, as a former team leader. From my perspective, we do trainings on culturally responsive services and kind of understanding that culture is a strength, right? And we need to sort of be step into that space as providers with a level of cultural humility, understanding that people's culture is often a major tool towards healing and growth and change. And so sort of being open to that is like step one. Anything else you'd add here, especially around language barriers, Colin?
Yeah, I just think it's important when we are like having these issues in our workspaces that and I don't know that you're doing this, but I think it's a very easy thing to do, right? When we start getting like frustrated and more frustrated with our participants when it's not actually a participant issue. Our participants certainly like can be frustrating, right? But I think what makes life easier for both of us is when we can separate that frustration. Something that Pathways did during my time at Pathways um, was they were incentivizing Spanish speaking folks who already worked at Pathways, who held different positions and could be available to the ACT teams to serve as like translators or interpreters, depending on the setting and situation for folks. So I think getting creative with like how we are engaging with our participants is probably how I may answer that. At Pathways, it looked like here's this like fluent, like Spanish fluency kind of like test, right? To like measure somebody like a current employee's like ability to communicate, translate, interpret. If they pass that, they might get a pay bump and then also be available to the teams needing those supports or the participants needing those supports. Ryan, I wonder if you were typing up a response to Greer. Okay, great. Awesome.
Yeah, I'll take that one. Greer asked the question, do you have recommendations for those of us who are not funded to have ACT teams? HUD, PSH grant budgets have been locked in for caseloads of 20 to 30 per case manager for over a decade in some cases. They can only manage one home visit per month. Yeah, this is a structural factor that really, when we're talking about high fidelity housing first, is going to get in the way. I do think this is a very state by state oriented issue. And I'm unsure. I know there's been some work in Kentucky around being able to bill Medicaid for these services. I'm unsure of the status of that, so I apologize. But I'll say that the way we do it is we do bill Medicaid, and we have really advocated here with our behavioral health managed care organization to use a per member per month billing rate. So we get a certain flat rate per member, assuming that we do at least 2 visits in a month, which that has enabled us to get away from a more unit-based billing, right? It used to be that we had to bill Medicaid for 15-minute increments at a time, and we'd only get paid for those 15-minute increments. And so now we're using this per member per month model. It's much better. We're able to sort of meet our revenue needs. But that's how it works. We're not using the HUD vouchers to pay for the services. We're billing Medicaid. So I apologize that again, I don't know the status of that in Kentucky, but let me know if there's further connection I can make with other folks at Pathways here to talk more about billing. All right. Well, let me keep us moving then. We've got about 15 minutes, just kind of saying this out loud for all of us, about 15 minutes until we get to the point where we wanted to kind of open up for a much more broad Q&A. And so we're going to kind of go through this comparison to traditional models somewhat quickly, and then have plenty of time for discussion.
Ryan might have actually been sharing that for me. Like, hurry up. The next thing we'll do is, and I want to be clear in this section, we're not saying like other models are bad, but many are different and are not housing first to Fidelity, and that's what we'll kind of break down here. So a linear residential treatment model is a very common model, right, folks? These might include places like drop-in centers, safe havens, or shelters, transitional housing programs, with kind of like medium to longer term stays, right? 6 to 24 months. Permanent housing may include community residences, small or large, single room occupancy residences, where social services might be on site. So these are really some of the differences between like housing first high fidelity and linear residential treatment models. There might be mixed use buildings, but I think in general, what's important to know here is that this is not empirically based, right? This comes from the idea of what do I think as a professional or as a helper, or an expert in this field that this person should be doing before they are placed in like something more permanent, right? So there's typically like a level system. I like to tell the story. I went to a boarding school and there was a level system, where if you were bad, right, or you didn't do your chores or do your chores well, like you would be on novice for the week, right? If you did really well, you'd be on Spartan. That was our school's mascot. But and it made people feel not very good, right? And I would assume that there's even more at stake when this isn't school. This is somebody's housing program, right? This is where they are receiving kind of some form of like comfort or more security than they would out on the street. But yeah, I think it's just as important to know that this model is not empirically based. All right. So here's another triangle, right? We said helping professionals love triangles. And if you remember us talking about flipping Maslow's hierarchy of needs on its head, this is another kind of example of that. What traditional models might require folks is for them to be absolutely abstinent of all substances, right? Before obtaining a bed, before engaging in therapy, before receiving a meal, really any sort of services. And after that, they need mental health treatment, right? Or some sort of like psych eval. And after that, they need to, meet all of these different needs and expectations of the program. And then we want them to get a job, right? And then after they stop using substances and are in mental health treatment, and then they find a job and are quite possibly still sleeping outside, then we're like, okay, you win, right? You are now deserving of a house. So this is something that we like folks to think about when we're thinking about housing readiness. Does it make sense for folks to remain abstinent from substances and to have stable employment before they find housing? A lot of these models come with some really punitive measures, right? They punish folks for displaying symptoms of their co-occurring disorders. And sometimes this punishment looks like termination from the program. We like to talk about, there's a phrase that we use I think it's called accountability without termination, right? What are we doing in our programs to talk about accountability with folks without terminating them from our program, right? For example, if anyone's ever like where I used to work at a methadone clinic, right? Very different than the housing setting. But if folks were using specific substances, they might be booted from the program, right? And that's what they came to treatment for substance use concerns. So that's an example of, getting rid of folks and terminating them from treatment for a concern that they came in looking for support for, which again speaks to maybe not a population deficiency, right? But something wrong with the program or the structure of that. But models like this actually serve to kind of like exacerbate things like chronic homelessness, right? And I think that's important to know and take away from here as well. Housing should not be a reward. It should not come at the end of like treatment. It should probably be part of that treatment, right? So here's a comparison of those two models. Linear residential treatment model is based on clinical assumptions. The assumption piece is important here. But what clients are and are not capable of, right? Who is housing ready? Who is not? What does this person need? What do I think this person needs? That expert mentality is used a lot here. Client has to demonstrate desirable behaviors to earn their housing. Whereas in the housing first model, we're just like, yeah, you deserve a home, right? Clients with severe mental illness require around-the-clock staff supervision, right? Because of that assumption or that stigma or stereotype that they are dangerous. Whereas we are putting folks in a home and then maybe assessing needs or letting them come to us with their needs or letting them communicate their safety concerns to and with their teams. Clients don't have a lot of say in their housing trajectory. They might take what they can get. The housing first model really likes to emphasize choice and let somebody make a pretty intentional decision about maybe the neighborhood they want to live in. Do they want to be closer to where they were receiving substances? Do they want to be further because they are prioritizing their recovery? Is there family in this part of the city that they really want to be close to or be far away from? Are things that folks might be able to make decide for themselves in the housing first model. And then again, we want to move people in as quickly as possible. Whereas in a linear residential treatment model, that's going to come with some stipulations and things that the clients or participants need to have in mind on their end.
All right, thanks for that. That was very quick. I appreciate you.
Yeah.
Want to talk a little bit about initiating services in a housing first model and how we can continue to lower barriers. So talk quickly about who qualifies for a program. I think we said some of this already, but I'm just kind of restating some of this. A housing first model, according to the Fidelity principles, is going to serve folks 18 and over, adults. Single adults. We get a lot of questions around what about families? We serve families. We want to do housing first. Totally possible. Other organizations are doing that. Great. Not a choice that Pathways has made. I think in part because of how intensive our OUD, our opioid use disorder population is, and the extreme complications that come with providing harm reduction services when there are families and especially young children involved. It's an area that we kind of have not stepped into, although of course we do have a number of folks that want to bring their partners into their homes. And so we kind of make a little bit of a don't ask, don't tell policy. If everything is fine and quiet and there's no problems, we usually won't raise any alarm bells, but that's not always the case. Also, we're talking about folks with serious mental illness and or substance use disorders as primary diagnoses. And of course, folks who are experiencing chronic homelessness. We're not typically the ones here at Pathways that do some of this prioritization, but I think it's worth thinking about who else maybe should be prioritized when there's a long list of folks who need housing. And so thinking about folks who maybe have chronic and acute health conditions, folks who are who are involved in the criminal legal system, or have a history there, or other issues that might disqualify them from other housing programs, right? We think this model is especially going to work for those folks, and this is one way to sort of triage the group of people that we might serve. Touching a little bit on some comments that we had made earlier, but in terms of program expectations, there's not a lot. Folks can choose their services, they can modify their services, they can refuse various services with some small exceptions. Folks are required to sign and adhere to a standard lease. Now we use a use and occupancy agreement, but that lease language is going to be mirrored in our use and occupancy agreement, right? It's going to be very similar to a standard lease with the exception that they agree to receive home visits and that they contribute 30% of their income. This can be a challenging thing to deal with, maybe for folks who receive an SSI check and for whatever reason they begin to stop paying their rent. A lot of conversation happens there. If we think that that is eventually going to cause problems and lead to them becoming unhoused again because they're not paying their rent, sometimes what we've done is we've become people's representative payee on a temporary basis to sort of see how that goes. Can we get your rent paid first, and then we'll give you the rest of your check, or can we parse it out to you in a way that feels right? I think the big thing here is in terms of program expectations and what people engage in. Again, kind of going back to that Hillary Melton quote, folks are going to refuse to engage in services quite a bit. And our job is to crack that door open and invite folks to come into treatment or into any sort of combination of services. Human beings are interdependent people. And so our effort is going to be to continue to build rapport, and eventually they're going to come to us with a need that hopefully we'll be able to help them meet. A couple of other things around program expectations. The model, the Housing First model, does require once a week home visits. I'll say actually, because of the way our funding works, we visit twice a month. So that's one way that we're not kind of adhering so strictly to the Housing First model. I see other folks in the chat. Somebody said once per month home visits. I think that is workable too, depending on the level of need of folks. And having the flexibility to see folks even more frequently is really required, especially during move-in times, during transition periods. We're seeing folks 3, 4, even 5 times a week to kind of help people get settled, stabilized, deal with crisis. Another thing that comes up is people refusing to sign paperwork, and that happens for us as well. In fact, frequently we have some folks who have been with Pathways for years and years and years who have never signed a single piece of paperwork. If that's truly a barrier to receiving services, we will ignore that requirement, right? We'll find ways to get verbal consent and document all that, and our funders have been okay with that. We know asking folks to sign paperwork can cause some suspicion between us. And so wanting to kind of lower barriers wherever possible. Alrighty. I will say there are a number of other evidence-based practices that make up Housing First practice. Harm reduction, you've heard us talk about quite a bit. Accepting the choices that people are making for their own health and well-being, but also trying to provide some education and support to help them make as safe of choices as possible. Motivational interviewing is another evidence-based practice that is like crucial to Housing First. MI kind of really gives us the tools to walk alongside people as they're dealing with their ambivalence in making choices that are going to be right for them, right? Hopefully we're able to help them make a choice that's going to be the best option in light of their own values and interests. And I'll pause here to say we have another training coming up through the Coalition for Homelessness, the Coalition for the Homeless on June 17th on motivational interviewing. So I'm excited to get a chance to hopefully talk with you all again on that date. And then trauma-informed care, apologies, it says May. That's not true. Trauma-informed care is another critical component of Housing First, and really kind of making that shift from what's wrong with you to what happened to you, right? Helping understand what somebody's story is, what led them to where they are, so that we can deal with that as they move in the direction of change and healing. Okay, want to give some quick takeaways, and then I'm going to open the floor for questions, comments, hoping folks will unmute. I'll ask you to unmute if you raise your little Zoom hand, but here's some key takeaways. Homelessness and co-occurring disorders do not stem from individual moral failings. We know that there are a number of environmental and individual concerns and challenges that lead to homelessness and co-occurring disorders. I think blaming people for their plight is not going to be a way to engage them and see them successful in the future. Housing First is a proven and measurable solution. Again, over 30 years of data demonstrating this. Pathways has been doing this work for over 15 years, and we've seen so much success in that time period. Housing First is highly individualized. There is not a one-size-fits-all, and that can be frustrating, but in the end, incredibly rewarding as well. In typical Housing First programs, we're serving folks who are considered not housing ready by traditional programs. And we take on that challenge. We welcome that challenge because we think everybody is ready for a home. If somebody is hungry, we don't ask whether they're food ready. And so when somebody is unsheltered, we believe they're inherently housing ready. And then when the work begins, we want to try and help people meet their basic needs and then identify additional goals and appropriate supports as we work with them up that triangle, up that hierarchy of needs. All right, we have reached the end of our comments here, our discussion and talk. So I want to flip us over to a Q&A period now. We've got plenty of time. Let's talk a little bit more about Housing First, what questions you have, what you're seeing out there in the work, and what needs you might have. I see the first hand, Greer. I wonder, oh, I usually see a ask to unmute button, but I don't see that here. I wonder. Apologies, Greer. I may have given you some wrong information
on her screen.
Yeah.
And if I do.
Maybe for now, as we're kind of thinking through whether we can get unmute working, if we can have people type in the Q&A box, that might be the easiest way, actually.
Yeah, I have some feedback for one of the questions so far. So Joe is asking, have you seen success using Housing First in rapid rehousing programs? So I think that the short answer is no, because rapid rehousing is not Housing First. But we have done trainings and some technical assistance with rapid rehousing programs that want to adapt some of the model or the pieces of the model that they can. Some of the things that don't make rapid rehousing much different than the Housing First model is the kind of time restrictions that are there, and it also being kind of like pretty close to linear residential treatment model, right? Here are the things you need in order, with housing being the end goal there.
Yeah, just to tag on with what Kala was saying there, often I have a slightly different answer, which is that, yeah, rapid rehousing programs do adapt the Housing First model. They're doing the kind of Housing First approach to services, and rapid rehousing programs see a ton of success. Where they see less success is when people come in with a great deal of need in terms of serious mental illness, a high level of substance use. Often that time constriction is not going to be enough for people to kind of move through their healing process, their ambivalence around changed relationships to substances, around work, around getting connected to behavioral health supports, right? So that is often where we see the challenge, is that like the level of need is so high that the time frame doesn't allow the success before the rental support goes away.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I also want to take back my no. I think my no around the success piece is mostly around like a rapid rehousing program implementing high fidelity housing first. Not that they are not successful or helpful for folks.
Yeah, that's a good. I like that. I think, Greer, you might have access to a mic that is possible right now. Can you say something out loud and let? Great.
Yep.
Okay, hit us.
Yep.
Let's go.
Okay, so I work at an agency that sort of has our whole own continuum right here. We have emergency shelter, we have transitional housing, we have permanent supportive housing that is both site-based and scattered site. So I see a lot of people in a lot of different stages of change. And I'm wondering how you handle referrals who genuinely express that they do not want their own apartment at the time. Like maybe they have sort of acclimated to emergency shelter and that's become their comfort zone. Maybe they explicitly don't want the responsibility and obligations of maintaining their own apartment. Maybe they explicitly don't want to pay their 30% of their income towards the rent. Maybe they express that they want to go into a treatment program first, or they say that they want housing, but the type of housing they want is just completely beyond FMR. It is not out there. I couldn't afford to live in what they're describing they want, which might be really a way of expressing that they're actually not comfortable moving into their own unit because of the type of unit they're expressing is what they'd be satisfied with. So I'm wondering how you address scenarios like that.
It's a great question. I want to ask Khalil to jump in. First, go ahead, Khalil. I'll speak after you.
Yeah, I think we never want to be making folks do anything that they don't want to do at Pathways also. And I think everything that you've named and described is also something we've experienced at Pathways. Our kind of like funding and like payment structure has like changed, and not our, their funding. There's some different billing things that make maybe engagement look a little different, but I know that previously somebody could be considered an engagement for quite a long time. So that means this person is not housed, but we are still able to provide maybe those wraparound services or the services that they are saying that they want and need in the ways that they want them before housing begins. So yes, we would love to get them in the home, and we think that that would be great and healthy. But if they're like, actually, I want to go to treatment, we want to support them in getting treatment as a Pathways participant. And we're hoping that long term, or like as we're able to like really foster and nurture that relationship, that that's something that might be open to in the future. Yeah, I think that's what comes to mind first for me.
Yeah, I'll echo that and say, like, my goal in that conversation is to like lengthen the time frame of that conversation, right? You said, no, I don't want this today. But kind of going back to those concepts around assertive engagement, I don't necessarily want to take your like no today as like a no, final, the end, we're done. I want to continue to ask. I want to continue to educate. I want to continue to actually make sure that I've built the right relationship first so that we can have maybe a more meaningful conversation. And certainly, like, for example, we just heard some of our medication for opioid use disorder team talking today in a previous training, saying that like sometimes folks are saying to us, the only way I'm going to go into treatment is if I know that there's like a house on the other end of it, right? And so we'll sometimes engage those folks saying, yeah, go to treatment first. We're going to hold this apartment for you until you get out, because folks know how difficult it is to like maintain sobriety, for example, when there's like poverty and homelessness on the other end of it, right? So I kind of want to differentiate that from like a reward, like using housing as a reward, but they're sort of setting it up for themselves as a reward, or at least like a stable net to catch them. And we want to be flexible to that. I think speaking to Khalil's point around like sometimes like our engagements are long, years. I'm talking like there is a person that I'm thinking of that they engaged this person for like 7 or 8 years before he finally said, yes, I'm ready to come inside. And so I think having funding structures and like organizational support that will allow a long-term engagement is ultimately what's going to make it possible to end chronic homelessness. Like that person who had been on the street for decades, through a 7 or 8 year long engagement process, finally came inside because it was available, right? And then finally, my like last comment is certainly like we have folks who say, I got to live in a congregate setting. Like I'm not living alone for whatever reason. It's not working for me. And so we have been flexible there too, where we have provided our wraparound support, case management services to people living in congregate settings, you know, in collaboration with that setting. Alternatively, we've said, fine, like we feel very confident about your decision for you, and that we have like established enough relationship and rapport to like get at the heart of the matter for you. And if you want to come and talk to us at some other later date, we'll be available. I guess I want to say to you that because you have this like wide spectrum of services, maybe the decision making looks different, but maybe it allows you even more flexibility to say, fine, you know, stay in this setting for longer, but maybe we'll keep our roles open for you down the line is the next step of that. Let me kick it back to you, Greer, and ask, like, did that answer some of your question? Do you have like follow-up questions? Would love to kind of keep dialoguing with you.
Yeah, I think that's very realistic. And I think in practice, that's often how we operate. I think sometimes the struggle is that we have these PSH grants, and there's best practices like getting people into housing within 60 days, and people get referred to the grant. And then once we have that intake conversation with them, it's clear that there's actually something holding that person up from actually enthusiastically moving into their own apartment, even when you give them lots of choices about what that apartment might look like. So I think sometimes the difficulty is with HUD claiming that its PSH is now housing first, but it hasn't funded it to be that level of intensive services. And it's also sort of begging the question or putting the cart before the horse, or assuming that everyone who gets referred is already at the stage of change where they enthusiastically want to move into their own unit.
Yeah, great comment. And I think like part of our work is to help move them, using motivational interviewing to help move them in the direction of readiness to make that decision. But as you're acknowledging, like that's not going to happen like in a kind of a very tight timeline. Certainly not by some grant funder's timeline, right? 60 days or whatever. That's not realistic to me at all. And so I think you've highlighted the discrepancy between permanent supportive housing and housing first permanent supportive housing, right? And so I think this is not helpful, but I'm going to say it anyway. Advocacy around, wait a minute, we're trying to do housing first. Our understanding of housing first is individualized and participant driven, right? Like that is the key principle that we're talking about in this case. And this person is not indicating a readiness to come inside, but they have all this other stuff that they want to work on that are serving as barriers. That's where our focus should be. And so I think advocacy towards funders in that direction is one of the only answers that I have there. Welcoming other questions and comments. Let's see. Talked about Joe's question about rapid rehousing. Greer is actually thinking very intensively about housing first. I can tell that you're like pretty in the work. So I appreciate that.
Ryan and Khalil, I would like to hear your thoughts on something that I've seen when I was administering housing programs, and I hear a lot of our case managers talk about this, is for those people that want housing, but they don't really want intensive services. And maybe they meet with you just because they're going to oblige you because they want to keep their housing. So they'll give you 15 minutes a couple of times a month. They might let you into the apartment. They might meet you at McDonald's, whatever. They're not interested in having conversations about supportive services. What do you talk about? How do you keep that person engaged? What does that conversation look like?
For me, we do another training. I apologize for referencing other trainings a lot, but I think this stuff all blends together. We have one whole slide in our assertive engagement training around the power of small talk, which I think sounds very basic. And I think if you think that sounds very basic, you're probably a good small talker. I am not a good small talker. I need to like work at that and be intentional about that. And to me, if they're willing to have me in for 15 minutes and talk about nothing related to treatment, I think that's a win, to be honest with you. I think they're eventually seeing me in their door 4 times a month or 1 time a month over the course of a 6-month or year or multi-year period is going to like automatically engender a level of relationship where we're going to be talking about stuff. And so when I talk about small talk, I'm talking about the weather. I'm talking about sports. I know it sounds very basic, but literally these are the ways that we get our foot in the door. And eventually there's going to be a need that we can help somebody meet. Eventually I'm going to have something that they need. And as soon as I provide that, that trust skyrockets. There is a survey, a research paper that I like to talk about engagement from the perspective of the participant. And what participants say who have been engaged, these are people with serious mental illness who were maybe considered difficult to engage prior, is material benefit is one of the quickest ways to building trust with somebody. And so what we do often is use food. Let's go get a sandwich together. when we're doing street outreach with people that don't want anything to do with us, we're bringing them coffee when we first see them. And we've got an individual who lives like on the riverbank in Philadelphia, who has an incredible setup, an amazing tent, bikes around to get everywhere, has a generator. I heard one time that he has a bread machine, has a great setup out there, does not want to come inside. And so over the course of several years, just showing up, even when he said, go away, fine, we'll go away. I'm coming back tomorrow, right? Showing up over and over again. Eventually he let us take him to some medical appointments. It sort of happens naturally. I think the consistency and the reliability and just like showing up over and over again is gonna provide things to talk about, and it's gonna provide that engagement. Now, that person eventually told us, I think to Greer's earlier comments, like, I am not coming inside. Like, I'm cool right here. And we backed off. And we said to the city, re-refer that person to us if they ever tell an outreach worker that they want to come inside, because we're ready. They don't want what we have to offer right now. Anything you would add there, Khalil, around those, like, what do you talk about conversations?
Yeah, no, I think that that's good. I think about like the trust piece and that being like incentivized are also like very like just natural ways to do this as well. Like pathways around the holidays and Thanksgiving, we'll drop off a meal to every single one of our house folks and our folks who are not housed if we can find them. And with a little card, you know, signed from their team and like the folks who have been supporting them. And I think that also is one of those ways that we can lean in, even when people are saying like, I don't know, right? Even if that is consistent. Um, I used to work at a runaway and homeless youth shelter, and one of the things like with kiddos experiencing like homelessness or displacement is like there's a ton of mistrust at first, right? And I'm not sure it's after working at like Pathways, I'm not sure it's specific to young folks, but I think in both of those spaces, like just like honing in on the relationship when we can, if we um, can slowly lead to something bigger, can slowly lead to like, okay, it is safe to like name this need to this person specifically or this team, um, in that sort of way. And I don't mean to compare like our adult population to children, but I think sometimes developmentally and because of like mental health and substance use, sometimes that those things make sense.
I think that's really helpful to put it into that perspective, because we go into this profession because we want to help people. And when we offer all of these wonderful services and the person doesn't want to take advantage of those services, we feel like failures. And I think to look at it in that perspective of that the small talk, if they're allowing small talk, that's success. We gave them 15 minutes of time where they were treated as just a normal human being, not a homeless person, not a person who is needy, just a normal human being that like we would treat our neighbor or our coworker. And so I think it's a mind shift for us to see small talk as being helpful and meaningful.
Yeah, and can I say also, like, if you are engaging in small talk for like a couple of years, but they're not accessing any of your other services, and they're not having any tenancy problems, maybe it's time to consider like what's the next step in their housing journey, right? Like that's a person that we would consider ready for our alumni program. And so we're looking at Section 8 vouchers instead of our permanent supportive housing vouchers or our homelessness vouchers, and seeing if we can get out of their hair. You know what I mean? Like now, if there are problems coming up, wait a minute, your landlord's complaining, X, Y, and Z is happening, then maybe we're having like a pre-contemplation versus contemplation type conversation, right? But if there are no problems, maybe they don't really need us. So that's worth considering as well.
Yeah, I also like the way you framed that as well and talking about like we come in to like be helping professionals and to help and like to support, and it can kind of be a shock, maybe like a little bit of like an ego hit when someone's like, thank you. One of the things we say a lot in like our trauma-informed care training and like our harm reduction training is that our participants are the undisputed expert on their experience, right? Which is hard when we feel like we come with expertise as well, right? But another thing I like to say is that makes all of our lives easier. When I'm letting this participant live their life, I don't have to take them to this appointment, right? I don't have to like be stressed about them like not complying, right? Or like whatever consequences or whatever comes next. When I'm letting them do what they want to do, and I'm here as a support when they decide they do want to do or execute something.
Yeah, sorry, I'm like rambling now, but another quote that Cullo will like stick his tongue at me for saying it again. I say it in every training, but it's a quote that says, "Healing is not a relationship between an expert and a problem. Healing is a relationship between human beings." And so I think if we can take that step, this small talk has value as like relational work. And that is often where healing can take place. And if we can like allow that to be, then some of the like the expertise that we have as case managers, as social service providers, they're going to access that on their own anyway, I think.
We've got time for another couple of questions or comments. Okay. I am not seeing anything, so we can go ahead and wrap up then. Ryan and Khalil, thank you. Glad to call you friends now. This has been fantastic, and we will get the slides out to everybody, and there will be a recording of this put up on the coalition's website in a few days. So if you want to go back and re-listen to it, or if you want to share it with somebody who wasn't able to participate today, then that will be a resource for you. So this has been excellent, very practical. You've taken some real philosophical and ideological concepts and been able to make it very practical for us. And that's what we wanted. So thank you for giving us not another Housing First training.
It's our pleasure. Thanks so much for having us. It's been great interacting with you all. I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.